We have a very special speaker from the Empire Center. Now, you're all familiar with the Empire Center. You should be. You should be getting emails from them. You should be reading about them. There are a handful of groups that, in my opinion, in this state, function for us, like the Manhattan Institute many times, the Hudson Foundation. There are a few groups like that. And the Empire Center for Public Policy, which was, by the way, founded years ago by our good friend E.J. McMahon, they're really one of the top groups. They have pushed for transparency in government. They do incredibly efficient analyses of the budget. They spend a lot of time being able to communicate their analysis. I mean, that's a dry area. Budgetary numbers is a very dry area. And I know you've been to our events where EJ has been able to give you a crystal clear view. The Empire Center has been really stalwarts in making things better for us. And and one of the things they do, which I'm not sure if you all realize that, for candidates, you can actually get some of their leadership to speak with them about different issues, which I know I used to take advantage of over the, when I was doing more of the local role. And I'm sure the Empire will be talking with, people like Lee Zeldin and others. They're nonpartisan, but for some reason, people who think like us are more interested in hearing what they have to say. I have not heard that Hastings is really looking to find out what the Empire Foundation Center could teach him. Well, what we do have today is, and we're very fortunate, Peter Warren, with an amazing background in D.C., but he's from New York, he's really not far from here, who has worked in all sorts of senior capacities with the Republican side of the aisle, in the House and the Senate on transparency issues, budgetary issues, and also was the associate director of OMB. So, I mean, frankly speaking, the fact that he's back here, and playing that role is such an advantage. I mean, OMB, $1 trillion here and there. You need somebody like him to be talking to you. It's really an honor for us. So, like I said, he's held a number of senior positions with the House and Senate committees. He wrote and helped pass federal legislation to increase the federal spending transparency. Federal spending transparency. So some of the laws that we live under right now, he was the author of. You can really see him on the media. You can see him in print. He actually succeeded E.J. McMahon in the position of policy director over Empire. Although E.J., I just spoke to E.J. yesterday, in fact. E.J. is a senior fellow there, and he's got a lot more freedom in what he does, but believe me, he's still doing what he always did, but gets to do it in a way that's more of his option. With that, I'd like to bring up Peter Warren, and he'll give us a little presentation. Then he will take a few minutes of Q&A. Peter?
Thank you so much, Jerry, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm really happy to be with this group here today. And I should say that our president of Empire Center, Tim Hoefer, gives his apologies. He really wanted to be here today. And Jerry mentioned, of course, our founder of Empire Center, the inimitable E.J. McMahon, who I think you're used to having here at this event. So I will serve, unfortunately, today as a poor substitute for E.J. and for Tim, but I'm very happy to be here with you. So Empire Center was founded, as some of you know, back in 2005. At a time when there were not enough free market voices. There's still not enough free market voices in New York. Some of them are here in this room today. But EJ, as the founder of Empire, and others really saw a need for a voice for limited government, for free markets, and that is a niche that Empire Center has worked hard to fill And today, we are the premier free market think tank that's focused on New York State, solely focused on New York State and local issues. And though, our bread and butter issues, and this is really where EJ, of course, is a New York institution, are tax and budget issues, but they're not only our only issues. And over time, as Empire Center's gotten a little bigger and had a little more resources, we have worked hard to branch out into other areas. And that's why when I took this job, one of the people I talked about it was a senator who I work closely with in Washington, Jim Langford of Oklahoma, and he said, "Oh, you're going up to New York for there's a wow." He's like, "Well, that will be a target-rich environment if you're going to be working with a free market think tank." And so, indeed, we do have a broad agenda. We put out a document near the end of the year last year called Altered State, which is basically our policy agenda across various areas for where we want to move the state forward, where we think that there is opportunity and need. And there's four general areas that we look at: taxes, spending, regulation/mandates, and finally, what Jerry referred to, really transparency and more broadly, government accountability. So in those areas, I just want to walk just briefly through those areas just to highlight what we are focused on now, where we think the big challenges are and the big opportunities are. So with taxes, and this is an area where I can only say so much in a brief time, but obviously with respect to personal income tax rates, the budget enacted last April raised personal income tax rates in New York so that we now have the highest marginal tax rate in the country. We have usurped California for those individuals living in New York City, high income top earners, million or above. And at the 25 million range, marginal tax rate is almost 15%, and it is, we owe 40% of our personal income taxes in New York State are paid by the top 1%, and we are ever at risk of out-migration of those individuals, and indeed, we have lost well over 1 million people in the last decade, as many of you know, including just in the recent year alone, 350,000, a third of 1 million people. And so the personal income tax rates, the recent rate hikes, these are something that we're very focused on, as I'm sure many of you are. Also, property taxes, again, no secret, New York has among the highest property taxes in the country, and that has long been the case, and that includes the absolute number, the total, the property tax bill that people pay in Long Island, many areas downstate, the median is the highest in the country. And then when you go upstate, what you see is the highest effective rates, where people are paying the highest portion as a percentage of their home value. And one thing that Empire and others really worked hard on, and EJ in particular, was on getting the property tax cap instated that went into effect in 2012 and has indeed made a difference. It's held, it stayed in place, we want to protect it. It has helped reduce at least that discrepancy between New York and other states by keeping the tax levies from increasing higher than 2% of the rate of inflation. That is going to be a challenge now that the rate of inflation is well over 2%. With respect to spending, I mean, this is what New York State government does, right? I mean, most of the budget in New York State, the majority of the budget is for healthcare and for education. And on those two areas, we spend more than anyone else in the country. We spend more per capita per Medicaid recipient than any state in the country. We spend more per pupil than any state in the country. In fact, we spend roughly twice the national average per pupil on education. And of course, this is coming at a time where we just reported on the most recent data that those pupils are leaving. They're leaving the public schools. 5% enrollment drop in just the last 2 years, 8% over the last decade. And what we kind of see is in education, we're looking for more supply to pay so that we can keep paying as much as we're paying on education. The unions are sort of, you know, pushing and are getting more aid, but again, it's going to fewer students, and so now we're getting into the performance in New York is only middling, and it does not correlate at all with the increases that we've seen in spending, but now the schools are trying to branch out into other areas. Like pre-K and various social services, which one wonders if they are, you know, to some extent a pretext for spending more money. And with Medicaid, Bill Hammond, who many of you know, who's the healthcare expert at the Empire Center, has recently pointed out most Medicaid recipients in New York most of them aren't poor, because we've expanded Medicaid so much. We've gotten into such a broad swath of the population that most people think of Medicaid, they think of poor people. That is not your typical Medicaid recipient in New York. So, I mean, another just quick couple of things on spending. Obviously, New York also has a massive public sector, and that is a very expensive public sector, in part because of the rules that we have in the state, like the Triborough Amendment, which allows union contracts to continue over at their same rate if there is a labor impasse. So basically, labor sort of holds all the cards under the existing rules. And we are pushing hard for changes there. We're also pushing to get better implementation of the recent Janus ruling, where you know, public employees are no longer held captive, where they have to pay their unions agency fees. That was a huge victory in the Supreme Court, but it involves a lot of hard work at the implementation level for individual union members to understand that they don't have to keep paying and that they have other options. And this is something Empire has invested a lot in that effort. And finally, I can't leave spending without mentioning single-payer healthcare. If you've seen the numbers for the cost of single-payer healthcare, everything else I said about the budget sort of gets put aside, because the New York State budget would primarily be a debate every year about what we're going to do with healthcare, because the entire budget would be going, the overwhelming majority, in order to pay for single-payer healthcare, and so all the debates about the budget would just be about healthcare. It would consume the entire budget. So aside from taxes and spending, there are huge mandate issues. One I want to mention right off the top is this came up at the Assembly and the state legislature's budget hearing on education. We really need to lift the charter cap. I mean, I talked about school spending. Yes. The charters yield better performance for less money, and parents have figured it out. That's why they are voting with their feet for charters, but their vote is not being counted because of the charter cap, including the lowest income areas of the city, which also happen to be the areas where the charters outperform the most, the traditional schools. So that is a fight, and at the same time, you've got folks in the state legislature, like Senator Liu, who are actually trying to sort of roll things back and make it more difficult. I mean, you already have the cap in place, but he wants to take away SUNY as a charter authorizer, when they've actually done quite a good job at this point. With respect to energy, this is an area that we recently hired an energy expert, James Hanley. I believe it's today. He has a opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. And we did that because the Climate Act, it is so daunting and so dangerous what the legislature has done. When they passed 2 years ago the CLCPA, and they basically created all these standards where we are going to transition by set deadlines to alternative energy, and that doesn't include natural gas. All these unrealistic deadlines, the Climate Action Council, which, and again, the legislature didn't say how this is going to happen. They just said, these are the goals that we want, these are in statute. We're not going to say how much it's going to cost because we don't care. We're not going to say who's going to pay for it. Apparently we don't care because we passed the law without knowing either. But we created a Climate Action Council and some other entities, which I think there's about 150 unelected individuals serving on the Climate Action Council and other entities, to which the legislature has outsourced its job to figure out how much it's going to cost and who's going to pay for it so they don't have to take responsibility. The Climate Action Council recently estimated, and it's probably costs a lot more, but between a quarter and a third trillion it's going to take in order to accomplish, to make this transition to alternative energy. But again, they're not saying who's going to pay for it, how much of it's going to come out residential consumer utility bills, how much other businesses' utility bills. You can look in vain in the recently released state budget to see how much the state is going to pay for it. It's all a mystery, but I am positive that businesses who are thinking about staying, whether to stay or whether to come to New York, are thinking about what is this big unknown variable that the Climate Act represents for them, because they don't know the answers to these questions either. Another thing, this is a long-standing issue, of course, in New York State, which EJ has done some great work in the past trying to quantify, and we are looking at this issue potentially being exacerbated, is the prevailing wage issue, which many people in this room probably know this, but the prevailing wage where construction contracts, public construction contracts, basically the state, employers are told what to pay employees on those contracts. They are told. They are like, we can do it for less, and they're saying, no, we want you to pay more. We want it to be more expensive for taxpayers, even billions more expensive. It is not, they are paid, the prevailing wage is generally, first, it's well above the market wage. Second, it's not even primarily about wages, it's about benefits. Most of because the pension benefits are also set, and they aren't set at a level for that individual employee. They're set to basically, they coincide with whatever the union's unfunded pension debt is. So the cost is just, it's tremendous, it's completely indefensible. And now prevailing wage, there was another recent law passed, which the legislature, again, they outsourced all the key decisions, but basically they're saying, well, even private sector projects, if you get a certain amount of like tax credits or something, you also have to pay prevailing wage. And there's a board that had yet to be appointed to do that, and the law, again, the legislature wrote a law which is very vague, subject to interpretation. So this board, when it's appointed, a quote public subsidy board, is going to make all the key decisions. So again, it's funny, the Democrats, there's obviously one party rule right now in New York, but it's odd how they're not actually using that authority to make a lot of decisions. They're outsourcing a lot of those decisions so they can't be held accountable. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? That's probably better. Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. And I know we want to do some Q&A, so I don't want to talk too much longer here. The other area I wanted to just talk about, again, what Jerry mentioned, transparency. And what Jerry and I were talking about earlier is, government accountability and transparency. It's important everywhere, but it's particularly important in a state where the government does everything, where all the, a lot of choices which are typically left to the private sector and spending that's left to the private sector is done by the government. So it ratchets up the stakes and it increases the potential for, more to be kept in the dark and for more corruption. And this is an area where, Empire Center, we feel like we had a really big impact. Again, my colleague Bill Hammond, in exposing the COVID nursing home scandal. I mean, this is an area, this is a large part of what Empire does. We submit these FOILs, these state freedom of information requests, and sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. Sometimes we sue. And in this case, we FOILed, they delayed, we sued, we won of the cover-up that was perpetrated by Governor Cuomo, and certainly that's one of the things that contributed to his downfall. But again, that's what we do. We keep publishing data. If you've looked at our C3 New York database, we publish all the salaries of public employees in New York. We publish public contracts, basically everything we can get our hands on. And it does take a lot of work. We do a lot of foiling. We work closely with the Government Justice Center, with Cam McDonald. And we are currently also pushing for reform, not surprisingly, because we have so much experience with it, of the Freedom of Information process to make it work better for New Yorkers, as well as for JCOPE reform. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I just want to say that there's a lot of work to do, obviously.
Yes.
There's a lot of opportunity to make New York a better place to live, a better place to work, a better place to attract businesses. But we do see a lot of opportunity, and we feel like we have had successes. We see hope for change. We see the sort of people that are in this room who care about their communities and who are forces for change. And so we are going to keep fighting, and we're excited about the possibilities ahead. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group. Thank you, Jerry, on behalf of the Empire Center. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
We can take a couple of questions. You have a question?
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Sam Rizzola from Staten Island, and we don't have school board in CDCs, so I've gone through many OMB reports. So you mentioned there's an increase in the education budget, and most of us think that's great. Our kids are going to get more money for school, but it was an amazing percentage, and I don't remember directly, that was a while ago, but I'm going to say 30% of that budget went for teachers' salaries. I don't have a problem with that so much, but it's a huge percentage of the budget that really never necessarily gets into the classroom as far as buying books and things like that for students. Do you have any information like that statewide, or what that really is?
It's a lot more than 30%.
It was a lot, okay, so I knew
we're talking more about roughly 75%. So when people talk about increasing spending on education, what they are talking about is paying salaries and benefits to more educators. I mean, that's
but
just
that's
a
not
fact.
what we think. We think it's going to the classroom. Then the other question is, the nicer money that is now coming back to New York City schools or New York State schools because the mayor had defunded our school budgets. Is any of that represented in what you said, or is that going to be a surplus? And are there any controls on how that money is being spent?
I'm sorry, the money that's coming back.
So Governor Cuomo had defunded the budget for quite a few $1 billion for a number of years, and we just won a lawsuit. Okay, and that money is now coming back to the state. Is that money included in any of the things that you spoke about, or is that going to be supplemental, or is there any way to know how that's going to be spent?
Is this the freeze on charter school funding that was in place for years?
No.
Or this is one of the cases where there was...
Just one about 6, 7, 8 months ago, where Governor Cuomo had systematically said, the economy is poor, so public education doesn't need this much money, and he withheld money. And we sued and we won this. Michael Rebell was the attorney.
Yeah, why don't we follow up on that? So I'd like to learn more about that. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I know everything that's going on in the budget. But that sounds interesting.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about transparency and the old age homes and things like that, what do you mean by transparency? Because I don't see the governor or the former governor being held at all accountable for
Well, he is no longer in office. Though we were pushing. So again, I think most people are probably familiar with there was manipulation by the governor and his chief of staff and apparently his health commissioner in terms of the data on how many people died as a result of being transferred to nursing homes. And one of the things that they did was they were only counting people who died while they were actually in the nursing home. While the governor Cuomo, former Governor Cuomo, was sort of, his fate was hanging in the balance. One of the things that we were pushing for when they were talking about impeachment hearings was to really get that issue front and center as part of those hearings. And then obviously that had a larger dynamic of its own. So that was never investigated to the point that, to our satisfaction, Bill Hammond has written about that, and that there should be an after the fact, essentially after action review needs to be done on that. So.
More questions? Okay, so he